and most especially for Peter Eisenman, to welcome him back here at the AA. I think almost exactly, I want to say 4 years after Peter came in for a wonderful discussion with Rem Koolhaas that was held in January 2006, which has produced a small book that he is one half of, the critical half of
No, I'm a
Supercritical.
quarter of.
And which Tom reminds me of the guys we're going to have in the back of the building here, back of the room in the South jury room, for Peter to be signing probably well into the evening after he finishes his lecture with us tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome Peter back. Okay. I think it's the case almost exactly 50 years from a first visit here in Bedford Square, where he came as he began work on a PhD thesis that many of you will know, the formal basis for modern architecture, which he wrote in the first 3 years of the 1960s, and during which he became a frequent visitor at a school in which, as he said, in many different ways, he learned things that he brought back to the U.S. And I think one of the great ironies of Peter's project on the East Coast of the United States is that he delivered the 1960s from London into a small farm town in New Jersey called Princeton, and really instigated an English invasion that fundamentally transformed, in really profound ways at times, architectural culture as we know it on the East Coast of the United States. Peter left the experience at Princeton soon after teaching there in the late 1960s, took his interest in teaching forward in an unexpected way by founding a school in Manhattan called the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, that many people will know as a school that was designed to really rethink the idea of an architectural school, certainly in the United States then. It most certainly did, and it became the door through which European theory, culture, criticism entered the U.S. in dramatic fashion. Peter led that institute for many years. One of the small sections of this book, in fact, is a wonderful conversation Peter does with Alvin Boyarsky in something called the AATV studio, where they sat in Saran chairs for a half an hour, and Peter discusses the impulse and the drive that led to him setting up the school in those years, an incredibly influential setting that many people passed through and that became the home for such unexpected projects as Rem Koolhaas's writing of Delirious New York, debates over Italian rationalism, whether architecture would be modern, postmodern, or something else, and ideas that really grew in fundamental ways throughout architectural culture worldwide. About 25 or 30 years later, Peter, having taught architecture, and in fact never stopped teaching studios in schools throughout the U.S. and overseas, set up in the 1990s what I still think of as probably the most radical form of a school in architecture, and in fact it was an invisible one that existed in 10 annual conferences held under the rubric of the Any Corporation, which in fact brought together architects, thinkers, scholars, and critics, and I think unfolded an architectural project that was unique in its time and really challenges the idea of what an architectural school would be by the end of the 20th century. It wasn't in fact a school at all. It was a light infrastructure that traveled around the world and brought together minds that, again, I think had a great effect on how we all understand architecture today. This is only the most recent of Peter's contributions to this school as an author. He published 2 monumental books in the 1980s documenting work that he was doing in the Black Box series that many of you will know. It's a great pleasure to welcome Peter back, and he promised me when we talked the other day that he would be doing a version of his Canonical Buildings lecture, which is something that he won't do tonight as he argues other points, but that he in fact has promised will be the reason to come back next autumn on exactly the 50th anniversary of a first visit to Bedford Square. Please join me in welcoming Peter Eisenman.
Thanks, Brad. Before I begin, I'm going to tell, Brett said that you need to warm these people up, a few anecdotes. First of all, my mentor, Colin Rowe, would say that once you've reached 70 or 75, you're allowed to sit to lecture. So with that in mind, I'm going to sit. Because clearly, if you do the addition, you don't need to see me. We're going to look at some pictures. You can hear me, all right? I ain't standing up. I don't think I stand up for the whole time. Interesting occurrences, just quickly as a preface. When I was in Columbia Graduate School in the year 1959, I had just finished working with Walter Gropius, and I went to an old professor and I said, what do you think? And I said, I think Gropius is a fraud. I said, this is ridiculous. I don't want to be here. It's just another corporate, place. And he said, come back to school. I went back to school and met Jim Sterling, who was in America for the first time. And Jim said, I guess he was on a jury or something, and he said, Eisenman, you're a great designer, but you don't know anything. So what you need to do is go to England and be with Colin Rowe. But I didn't take his advice quite literally because, and this is not a nostalgia evening, by the way, I just get this out of the way. I won a Fulbright scholarship to go to France. I spent the whole summer learning French at graduate school at Columbia. Had to have a graduate level proficiency. I sailed on the SS Flandre. I saw the first movie that Alain Delon made, Plein de Soleil, in 1960 on my way to Paris. I arrived in Cherbourg or Le Havre or something, and I got on the boat train, got to the Gare du Nord, and I got in a taxi, at which time my brother had been living in Paris, and I said, je voudrais le rue Guy Gilles-Lecourt. And the taxi driver turned around after 8 suffering weeks, and he looked at me and he said, hey, buddy, it'd be better if you spoke English. I didn't think I could deal with that, and so I turned around, took the next train back to Le Havre and went to Cambridge, where I had a place, and that was how I got to England. When I arrived in Cambridge, I had just placed high in the Liverpool Cathedral competition. I didn't know that. I arrived, and Sandy Wilson, who was then the first-year master, was going out to America, and they used to say out to America in those days. You have to understand, it was like the Wild West. And Leslie Martin, the professor, said, why don't you be first-year master? I didn't know anything. My students were clearly smarter, quicker, and brighter than I was, as they still are. But somehow I've survived to this point. 2 other occurrences, which I think are important in the life of this school and my life. One is that at Princeton, as Brett said, we had an English colony, and for a long time, and that's one of the reasons that Bob Maxwell, sitting here, my longtime friend, eventually became dean at Princeton as part of the English colonial movement. I, at a certain moment, was denied tenure at Princeton. I was thrown out. And so that was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I had to go and do what I eventually did. If I had stayed in Princeton, I think I would probably not be here today. But another interesting occurrence, which I was telling Brett about today, that only Alvin Boyarsky and I know, is that Alvin was up for a position at Cambridge, and he was a Rowe acolyte, and I was determined that there were going to be no more Rowe acolytes in Cambridge. And so when we had our faculty meeting, and I told this to Alvin because I saved his life, I voted him down, and he was denied a position at Cambridge, and they eventually took the headship here at the AA, and the rest is history. So I was saved from being thrown out of Princeton. He was saved at being thrown out of Cambridge. One final little P.S., as it were, or pre-publication notes. I picked up a copy of a new Rem Koolhaas book. I thought it was an AA publication, but it's not. And one thing I don't mind is being thrown out of places. I do mind getting thrown out of history. because that's forever. And I open this book, and it says, Rem Koolhaas wrote his Delirious New York at the Institute under the guidance of the then director Emilio Ambas. And Emilio Ambas was never the goddamn director of the Institute. And I'm looking for that guy. I was hoping maybe he'd come tonight because the printed word carries a lot of weight, especially we have so many PhD architects these days who are doing work on minutia, who designed the second edition of Venturi Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas. An historian spent an hour telling us about this. And it doesn't bear telling, but I got to correct the Emilio Ambas story before it goes any further. So if you know this guy, what was his name, Damiani or what? I don't know. He may be around, lurking. Anyway, the talk I want to give tonight is a two-part talk. One is the Peter Eisenman State of the Union. I thought of this the night that Barack Obama gave his first State of the Union, and he said the State of the Union was in great shape. Living there, I don't think so. I'm here to tell you about the State of the Union of architecture, not the union of Britain and America, but a view from America. And I don't think architecture is in such great shape either. So I want to talk about why and what are the causes of this. And then I'm going to show a single project which we've been working on for 10 years, the City of Culture in Galicia. I just came back from there. And I have new pictures, and I think it'll be interesting to show it, since part of it is opening this autumn. The State of the Union that I want to talk about deals with a dialectic that was very much operative in architecture in the second half of the 20th century. That is, between, I think, 1960 and what I would think almost up to the present. And it deals with the dialectic between two terms, one genius loci and the other zeitgeist. And both of these terms, in a very interesting way, have played an enormous role in conceptualizing what architecture is and how it might act in a socio-political economic situation. The term zeitgeist is a late 18th century term that the German philosopher Johann Herder coined, because the term that had been in effect before that was another genius term, and that was genius speculi, which means the genius of time or the genius of the century. And so the genius loci is the genius of place, that is the spirit animating place, and the genius speculi or zeitgeist is the genius activating time. And of course, architecture concerns itself with time and space. Mies van der Rohe in 1924 in the third issue of a magazine called G, which he edited with Theo van Doesburg and L. Lissitzky in Berlin, made the famous statement, architecture is the will of the epoch translated into space. And of course, the really issue is will of the epoch. And of course, Colin Rowe, who is an anti-zeitgeist person, used to always say, how the hell does the will of the epoch know what the translation is? What does space look like in this particular will of the epoch? I can always remember him saying that. But of course, the term space is important because a lot of people today no longer believe that architecture is about space, it's about surface, and we have several surface people floating about. That space was an invention of modernism, supposedly. 6 years later, in 1930, Gropius then made a statement that we need to find, for the Deutsche Werkbund, we need to find a German architecture. Now, the minute he says, Mies says German architecture, we're into genius loci place. That is a German form of architecture. And in 6 short years, we move from a zeitgeist to what could probably be called a Volksgeist. In other words, the spirit of the people, which becomes the spirit of the place when the Nazis take over and turn it into Blut und Boden, blood and soil. That is, you have to be rooted to a certain place, etc. I asked a student the other night, because there are 3 phases to this evolution from of the genius loci zeitgeist debate. I said to you, if you were a Denise Scott Brown trying to make a name for yourself as she did in 1972, and she went to Las Vegas and decided that she could write a book called Learning from Las Vegas, which has influenced more architecture, I think, than any other book that I know in the last half of the 20th century. She went to Las Vegas in 1972. And I said to the student audience that I was speaking to, and I say it to you all, if you wanted to be a Denise Scott Brown or a Robert Venturi, and you wanted to put your name on the map, where would you go today to do such a work? That is, to define a new idea about space and time and place. And I don't have the answer to that. I don't think it's so easy. And therefore, it's going to raise the issue of genius loci and its condition today. I was raised by a man, Colin Rowe, who was had an enormous aversion to zeitgeist and to spirit of the age. He read things like Karl Popper, The Poverty of Historicism, which is a historicism being a projective and propelling idea that time presses you forward. He always considered me the epitome of the zeitgeist. That is, I was Mr. Modern, Mr. Zeitgeist. Now, of course, these terms become very problematic when we look at, first of all, Rowe's book of 73 and 74, when things start to get muddy, and we look at Collage City, because Collage City is both about the zeitgeist, that is, plans, and it's also about collage, which is definitely a modernist occupation. And no one would have thought of, in a sense, of having a collage city that didn't have elements of the zeitgeist and genius loci. Genius loci first breaks onto the scene with Norberg Schultz's first book, Intentions in Architecture, in 1963, and I remember reading it. It was before I had finished my formal basis, and I said, my God, this guy stands for exactly what I'm against, you know, and it was a really wonderful foil for me. And then he comes out with a second book called Genius Loci, which is what he does is move the idea of genius loci from an abstract concept to a phenomenological concept. That is, you have to have presence. And of course, the real issue is presence, the condition, the manifest condition of the metaphysical project instantiates itself in the Genius Loci book. And this is where it becomes a problem, not an abstract or conceptual idea, but runs into phenomenology, which is another whole issue we won't move into tonight. But what's interesting is it spawns an exhibition called Roma Interrota, which is happens in 1978 and involves people like Jim Sterling, Leon Creer, Colin Rowe, and others as a way of looking at the genius loci problem, by attacking Rome, and particularly attacking Rome through the Noli map of Rome, which is a figure ground map, the first figure ground map, but it's not merely figure ground because a man by the name of Bufalino had done a map a century before, which was a black and white map. But what Noli did was to show those spaces that the public could get in white. So the buildings weren't all in black. They were carved out with public space. So it was basically a public-private game. Roma Inter Rota was really very important. There was a special issue of AD edited by Norberg Schultz, who gave the whole thing where there were many abstract people involved in it, like Jim and Aldo Rossi, as well as the phenomenological people. Again, Schultz took this exhibition and turned it into a genius loci. In reaction to that, almost only 6 months or a year later, there was an exhibition called 10 Projects for Cannaregio, which lined up those of us who were opposed to the genius loci concept, who were quasi-zeitgeist people, who had Aldo Rossi, John Haydock, Raymond Abraham, Rafa Moneo, Peter Eisenman, Bernard Hösli, etc., in an attempt to right the ship. And then it was sponsored by Manfredo Tafuri, who very much against the thinking of Norberg Schultz, etc. Following back from that, we have in 1980, the supposed first semi-annual International Architectural Biennale, sponsored by Paolo Portoghese. Now, what's interesting about this, he takes all of the genius loci architects, like Venturi, like Rowe, like Stern, like Graves, Creer, etc., and he mixes them with Rossi, Scolari, and others, Koolhaas, and produces a project of facades of buildings now. These are, in Venturi's terms, decorated sheds, because all you have is the decoration and nothing behind it. And rather than being a genius loci project, which it started out to be conceptually, as that is the idea of place intervening into presence, it became a zeitgeist phenomenon. And this is where the thing shifts, so that zeitgeist now is a postmodern phenomenon and detached from place. And this is where, in the 1980s, the situation becomes rather strange. So we have, that takes us to 1980. The Venturis, meanwhile, first of all, Bob produces a book in 1966, Complexity and Contradiction, which is, you could call it a zeitgeist book, because he's talking about architecture through the ages being able to manifest itself in different forms in the present and in presence. And then suddenly there's a shift in 1972 with Learning from Las Vegas, and that's why Learning from Las Vegas is very important. A shift from architecture qua architecture, that is, as an autonomous discipline, to something else. And we have the formulation of the duck and the decorated shed. The decorated shed is, in fact, what Las Vegas was, and ducks were buildings that looked like their function. And, of course, the famous Long Island duck that sold ducks. And this was a very clever formulation on the part of the Venturis. So the Venturis, if we go back now and take a look at Mies, Venturi, and bring it up to date to Rem Koolhaas, we're going to find 3 generations of strategies of dealing with what I call capital. That is the emergence of capital as a phenomenon in culture, in media, in the arts, and in architecture. And we have to begin to notice that Mies van der Rohe is the first generation of architects that have to deal with capital. And of course, the difference between Mies in Europe and Mies in America has to do with the kinds of clients that begin to use Mies, and one is Seagram, the other is Armour, when he does the Armour Institute. And what happens as capital begins to take hold, especially after World War II, when, in fact, the modern movement, instead of becoming a good society, becomes the good life, and we have corporate buildings being built by any number of firms like Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, I.M. Pei, Saran, and others. These buildings, by the way, which were modern icons in the 50s, are now empty shells sitting in an amazing sort of graveyard in New Jersey and Connecticut, etc. These fantastic white buildings, monstrous size, lay empty today because they no longer serve the function of capital that they served in the 50s. I would argue that Mises Seagram building, for all its renown, was a compliance with the idea of capital, because Park Avenue, or the idea of avenue, always was that buildings lined up on the street, except for St. Bartholomew's Church. Even the University Club held the avenue. And Mises building, unlike Lever House, which held the avenue at least for several stories, was set back from the avenue because Seagram demanded this. That is, the client demanded that they break the existing zoning, go for a deferral of that zoning. So what happens is, even though Mies runs into Armour and clients like this, I would argue that he is above capital. He doesn't have to come to terms with capital. He's able to, through his own reputation, deny the effects of capital. The Venturis now, 20 years later, in other words, we jump from the 1950s to the 1970s, can no longer transcend capital, and capital is not this encased condition. It is now moving into all sectors of meaningful architectural display and decorum. And so what I would argue is that learning from Las Vegas, as opposed to complexity and contradiction, becomes an accommodation with capital, has to deal with capital, and therefore the duck and the decorated shed become icons of this accommodation with capital. And I think that what happens is, as we will see as I move through time, is that capital not only takes over the arguments, the philosophic arguments, but it destroys the dichotomy between genius loci and the zeitgeist, because genius loci becomes zeitgeist, that is, capital phenomenon. What happens then in the 90s is that Rem and others are confronted with marketing, branding, all kinds of things that are the third phase of what I would call late capital. And that's why the lecture 2 that I would give tonight has to do with the whole idea of lateness and its relationship to the project of capital, but also the project of surface. And this is where Alejandro and I have probably come to grips with a problematic that I think that surface is the latest accommodation with capital, that surface, in fact, are decorated ducts. Either they're decorated ducts or that there's no longer any decorated sheds, it's just pure decoration, and that signage has become a thing in itself. I say this because, before I get to REM, the idea of branding or the idea of capital was always associated with place. In London, you were known to shop at Savile Row. It wasn't necessarily Huntsman or whatever. It was Savile Row tailors. They were a place. Now you can go to any number of airports and find Savile Row tailors who are no longer Savile Row, but their name. Faubourg Saint-Honoré was a shopping street in Paris where you would go for Hermès clothes. In Las Vegas now there are 11 Hermès. So there's no longer any place associated with this quality product. Place doesn't matter. You can have it in Macau. You can have Venice in Macau, Venice in Las Vegas. Anything goes, and there's no place anymore. The final thing, which is important to me, because I grew up that Madison Avenue was the place to shop for men's clothes in New York City. This just happened to me this week. And I still buy my clothes at Brooks Brothers because I am a troglodyte and a self-avowed one. I used to be a radical, but you know, after 70, it doesn't pay, so better to be a troglodyte. In any case, Brooks Brothers was on Madison Avenue, and it wasn't that it was Brooks Brothers so much, it was Madison Avenue. That's where you went. I was in Newark Airport last week, which is a sort of blue-collar, dumbed-down version of JFK or LaGuardia. It is the place where the less fortunate take airlines, right? And I was happening to fly out of there. You try not to do that. And there was a Brooks Brothers in the Newark Airport. And I thought, there we go. And so I went in there and I said, does anybody shop here? Because the kind of clientele that are in Newark Airport don't go to Brooks Brothers. It's not, you know, they may go to Zara or Hugo Boss or whatever, but not Brooks Brothers. And she said, no, it's really a real problem for us. So the brand doesn't work because it's been shifted out of its location. And so that's one of the problems that we find with the question of genius loci. Does it exist? Does capital allow genius loci to exist? That's number one. Number two is the scale of build. Because even Mies had to suddenly increase the scale of his projects. The Mannheim Theater project, the 50 by 50 house, all are blow-ups of smaller scale projects. And so Lakeshore Apartments, Seagram, all became bigger and bigger. What has happened today is that development, private development, which controls much of the market in at least the East and the United States, it has to assemble larger and larger parcels of land to make things work. In other words, to make economics work. And so you have larger and larger projects done by larger and larger firms who can no longer maintain the level of intensity of the work I maintain. And we get these gigantic projects. And of course, the project I'm going to show to you tonight is just such a project, that we couldn't just do one building or two buildings. We had to do a city of culture. We had to do 1.5 million square feet. We had to do 6 buildings at the same time. I mean, who has ideas for 6 buildings at the same time? You know, the human mind doesn't work that way. So that what we have is that, and where the shoe fits, people should wear it. Because, to design, I know someone designing a city for 3 million people in China. And I say, a city for 3 million people? Now, I know Corbu did one for 100,000, which was a disaster, the Villaradiers, but 3 million? Jesus. I mean, what the hell would that be like, and how would you do that? And what kind of an idea would you have? Would you just pump up a little city until 3 million people? So it is the project of scale has also become a project of capital. And I think it becomes an enormous problem. I think that what happens is that we architects become prisoners of globalization, of media, and et cetera, because people don't hire me because I'm a good architect. They hire me, they think, because I'm good media. We just got a 40-story tower in Milan. Now, all of us have enough ego to say, we're not going to turn that down. I don't want to do a 40-story tower in Milan. Milan is a wonderful 6-story city. We should be doing 6-story housing. And the site's big enough. We could do all of the housing on 6 stories. But the client has said, no, we want to make a statement. And I said, what do you mean you want to make a statement about how people should live? No, how we look. And so we're doing a 40-story tower. Is this the end of Peter Eisenman and a corruption? It could be. But since none of my colleagues worry about that sort of thing, I'm not going to be the only one to sort of go out and say, here, I ain't going to do it, right? Here, let someone else do it. We have a 500,000 square foot shopping mall. I asked somebody in shopping, is that a big one? They say, yeah, that's a big one. And you say, what the hell am I going to do architecturally with a 500,000 square foot shopping mall? Haven't a clue, right? What kind of architecture do they need? And they don't need architecture, they need signage, right? And so what you're doing is a shed for signage. And I've never done that before. And, do they need space? No, they don't need space, because the guys designing the space are the guys that are selling off pieces to individual clients for their shops. And of course, this shopping mall is on a horrendous beach, beautiful beach in a terribly industrial area outside of Naples. We've been doing the master plan of. And I say, we don't need a shopping mall here. That's just what we don't want. It's an awful place. Let the beach be nice, right? And they say, no, we want a shopping mall. At what point do you retire? This is not something that I share with my clients because it pays the bills. But I'm not convinced that we are any longer in control. There's another issue which I think is important that comes out of this issue of the notion of scale, the notion of how capital has now influenced as clients our market. And that has to do with terms that I'm more familiar with is grammar and rhetoric. And I think grammar and rhetoric are a subset of the metacritical project, Genius Loci and Zeitgeist, because to me, Zeitgeist is everything and there is no Genius Loci. The 500,000 square foot shopping mall could just as well be in Apulia or Rimini, anywhere, has no bearing to its site, sitting on a beach. The 40-story tower has no bearing to the infrastructure, the scale and texture of Milan. It has to do with something else. So there is no such thing as Genius Loci, and the project I'm going to show tonight is an attempt to see if there's another view of the Genius Loci project. But the final issue for me from the metacritical and of course the meta-metacritical is the metaphysical project. Does the dialectic operate in global capital? Has global capital crushed the Kantian Hegelian dialectic? And if so, how do architects think their projects? If we get to grammar and rhetoric, what's interesting is that to begin the 20th century, Le Corbusier set up a grammar of what modern architecture would be. He set up the 5 points. He set up the 4 compositions. This was his grammar. And then he evolved this grammar so that it became rhetorical. And when it no longer was operative, that is, the grammar could no longer function as, a house is a machine to live in, and the kind of aphorisms that Corbu made, modern architecture died along with much of Europe in 1939. After the war, there was no new grammar and there was no new rhetoric, so that the architects just did modern style buildings. They made decorated sheds instead of, let's say, ducts, which were grammatically sound. In about 1980, Paul de Man articulated an idea that in an article called Semiology and Rhetoric, where he said, in a semiological, that is, in an environment of meaning, it is possible to establish rhetoric before one establishes grammar, and in fact, that the rhetoric, in fact, allows for the possibility of a new grammar. And I think that this is where, if we accept the situation, because we are not going to, there's not going to be a revolution, if we accept the situation, then the situation is full of rhetoric. The rhetoric of branding, the rhetoric of surface, the rhetoric of product, the rhetoric of expansion. What is the grammar of the architecture? In other words, where is the architecture to be? And I think that what faces us as architects, as teachers, and as students is we don't have a grammar to fulfill the rhetoric if we accept the rhetoric, and there's nothing much to do. In other words, what is the grammar of a 40-story tower in an unplaced place? What is the grammar of a 500,000 square foot shopping mall on a beach north of Naples? I don't know the answer. And of course, in my teaching, I set up projects now where I used to set up grammatical projects and evolving grammar into rhetoric so that the students understand this direction. I now realize there's no sense teaching grammar in school. You have to teach how can rhetoric evolve into grammar. And so I set up rhetorical projects for students, and they have to find the grammar to articulate that rhetoric. One of the problems, though, is that what's happened to my students and students, I think, anywhere, is the computer. And I'm reminded of an article I read recently in the New York Review of Books by Garry Kasparov. And Kasparov, who is a world champion, world master chess player, used to tutor young people, very expensive tutoring, and he would teach them how Garry Kasparov played chess, as I try and teach architects how I play architecture. And Kasparov said, something strange has happened, because the student that I used to teach, the 11-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old phenomenon, can buy for 40 quid a grandmaster computer program that's better than I am, right? And so that this kid of 11, 12, and 13 begins to learn how to play chess, not against the intuitive Garry Kasparov, but against the computer. And he said, I have found that the kids are turning into computers, that they're losing their native intuition and intelligence and starting to play chess to win like the computer plays chess. And he said, it's very different. Now, let's extrapolate that argument to architecture, because what I'm finding with my students who no longer can draw, and of course drawing is for troglodytes, you know. I mean, even in my office, we don't have anybody drawing except me. And I don't draw very well. But we don't take students unless they know Rhino, Maya, etc. And of course, Frank Gehry was around the other day trying to hawk his CATIA system and saying, you know, you're the perfect guy for doing CATIA, etc. And I said, oh, yeah. I said, I can't even do Rhino or Maya. In any case, what you find among at least students in America, and that's why I talk State of the Union, basically the people that I deal with, the younger generation, is they're beginning to behave like computers. And they begin to believe that they are a computer. They have lost a capacity to intuit and to intelligently respond to conditions in a way to develop grammars. And the grammars that they have come out of the computer. So we're now tied to computer programs which weren't designed for space-time architectural environments. The algorithms were for animation, for other kinds of issues, for media, and not for producing space and time in an architectural sense. And we now have something which is a disease, the parametric process disease, which you know, has taken over in all leading institutions. And I was at a review at Harvard last spring, and I met a very bright student. I was on his review, and he said, I said, well, you know, it's a year-long project at Harvard. And he said, I said, what did you do? He said, I wrote an algorithm that could produce any X amount of variation. I said, oh my God, X amount of variation. How do you choose? He said, choice is no longer the issue, right? I said, oh, okay. Any one will do. And of course, all these things look like weird chicken coops when you see parametrics operating, right? And they all look the same. And so I thought, well, here I go. I'm going to be Mr. Genius Loci. I'm going to ask, you know, what's the function? Because I never, or what's the site? And so I said, so this is great parametric process. And then he showed all of the variations, all of them chicken coop, you know, punch surfaces, Alejandro, right? Since you were one of the problems in this area. Well, he's going to be teaching with me, so I'm happy that I have somebody to play with. But in any case, you know, the source of the problem. In any case, I said to this young student, well, what was the site? He said, oh, it was a wonderful site in Hong Kong Harbor. I said, oh, that's nice, on an island in Hong Kong Harbor. And I said, so that because it's in this island, you can choose any one of these chicken coops. Since there's no place, it's in a sense, but there is. And I said, well, what's the program? I couldn't believe it. You have to understand, a year at Harvard, right? $50K for this. And he said, my project, you hear this, is a golf driving range. I said, a golf driving range? I said, what kind of social program is this? He said, well, in the East, in Hong Kong, golf driving ranges are really important. There's no place for people to play golf, so they go to golf driving ranges. And he said, you know what's amazing about these chicken coops, sorry, he didn't use the term, is that you can drive the golf balls out into the bay because there's no limit to how far you can hit the golf balls. You can hit them through different holes. You can have different size holes. You know, one makes 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards, etc., depending on the surface. And I gave up. I said, I can't deal with this. This, to me, isn't what architecture is about. Maybe none of you have that problem yet, but the State of the Union in America, we call it the University of the North, where I live. But anyway, it is a disease that is certainly spreading. And students today, for example, some of the students that I know at Yale are afraid to take courses with people like Greg Lynn and others because they don't have the computer skills. And they say, well, if we don't have the computer skills, how can we do a Greg Lynn studio? So I think one should be aware of this kind of thing. That having been said, and I think that surface and branding and capital and scale have taken over to such a degree that I think it's very difficult to do a small project. Again, that having been said, I was asked to do a 1.5 million square foot cultural center in Santiago. We won a competition against some interesting architects, but still, I was reminded of Richard Meyer's Getty Center, which I think shows the failure of most American architects who are unable to deal with scale and anything larger than the individual house, that what they do is blow up things in scale. And of course, to me, the Getty Center is the sine qua non of blowing something up in scale. There are 6 little houses blown up into 6 major buildings on a mountaintop in Los Angeles. I don't think it's genius loci, and I don't think it's zeitgeist. I'm not sure what it is. Well, we wanted to avoid this problem when we did our project. So I'm going to show the project. I can't tell you if it's going to be successful or a failure. It's certainly my career, let's say, doesn't hang in the balance because I've already been erased from history in this Rem Koolhaas book. But, and it may never be finished in my lifetime because it takes the Spanish a long time to do anything. To decide, I mean, you find, especially in Galicia, I hope no Galicians are here, but the story they tell about Galicia is you meet a Galician on the staircase and you ask him which way he's going, and he doesn't know, up or down. We never know which way our project's going, up or down. In any case, I'm going to just show some pictures, recent pictures of this project, and then have some questions. So with that, we'll turn the lights down and look some pics. This was the competition model. It certainly was a genius loci project in the sense that this is a hilltop that we cut off and carved into it a series of buildings coming out of the ground, that is, the ground becoming figure as opposed to the other genius loci argument of figure and ground. So that was the first critique of genius loci that we made. We didn't make buildings as signs. There are no signs. They don't look like buildings, and they don't look like their function. So all they do is carve the Santiago is one of the 3 major pilgrimage centers, Rome and Jerusalem, the other 2. And Santiago, for example, this year, which is the year of St. James, his birthday being on a Sunday, will have 12 million pilgrims coming through this site. And these are the pilgrimage routes that carved from the downtown site to the Cathedral of St. James. Next, please. Here is the state of play of the buildings. This is an archive building, a library, it doesn't matter, a museum, a study center building, all built out of concrete steel and faced with local stone, which is an interesting project since I've never done buildings with local stone before. But you can tell the scale of the project. These are 4 buildings that will be complete this year. There's another museum building and a opera house which has been started here, which they'll both be complete in another 2 to 3 years. Next, please. A close-up view of the archive building and the library, the museum over here, and the study center. And you can see the beginning of the foundation wall for the opera house, music hall opera house, and the services part of that. Next. It's a building that this is the view of the the archive building. There are two towers by John Haydock. An interesting story. John was one of the 5 architects, a very good friend of mine, and very devout Catholic, had made several pilgrimages to Santiago, wrote a book of poems about Santiago, where these two towers were on the cover of that book. They symbolize a west facade of a church without a body, because as he was dying, and this project was done in his last year's body racked with cancer, no longer believed in the physical embodiment of the church, that it was a spiritual idea. And so here are the western facade without a body. And on his deathbed, I promised John that I would build these towers for him. The president of the region of Galicia agreed to do this, and here they are. What is wonderful about those towers, and I don't have a shot today, but if you're standing here, you look between them, and they frame the towers of the Church of Santiago downtown, the pilgrimage church. Next, please. At dusk, and there's a whole story about the glass. I'm not going to go into I'm just showing the project as it happens to tie into the problematic that I put forward tonight. Next. Here is an interesting issue, and of course, one of the issues that I've been talking about is you will see that we are dealing with soffits that have a lot of articulation, which come from a whole set of traces and grids that manifest themselves in this project. And in several places, they are repeated with a glass floor. And so that you get the reflections, the articulation of these surfaces into the floor. And the whole idea being that the space is no longer now the section between the vertical walls, but between the floor and the soffitted ceilings, so that space occupies a horizontal dimension as opposed to a vertical direct dimension. Again, playing against the theme of figure ground, that is, a layered ground surface all the way to the roof as opposed to a figure on ground. Next, please. Next. These curves are not either romantic or figural for their own, or gestural. They deal with the play of the lines of the medieval paths as they pass through the building. You can see the Cartesian grid at many different scales. And there's the play between the medieval, the Cartesian, the topological, and topographic that operate simultaneously in the project. Next, please. These are all pictures taken in the archive building. Next, please. Next. Next. This is, we will see this is the second shot you will have seen of this museum surface. What we did to get this surface without any ducts or vents or interruptions in the surface was to build a roof and waterproof it. This is the waterproofing. And then build a steel frame, a 3-meter steel frame above this to take the tiles. And you will see the tiles are each about 1 meter square, have 4 bolts and grommets that tie through to the steel frame so that you can walk underneath the tiles. All of this is walkable underneath, and the rain runs off underneath. The tiles are not cemented in any way. but bolted through to the structure. Next, a drawing of one of the caminos that pass through between the buildings. Next. And there's that same place. And you can see the way that the stone is laid up has nothing to do with the capacities of the stone to be either load-bearing or ornamental. It's merely a cladding of a steel and concrete frame. Next. This is the library building. Each building has a different set of sections. The horizontal layering of this comes, there's a level up here, a level here, and a level down here, all play through, and there's very little vertical articulation. It's always the horizontal articulation that takes precedence. Next. These are the bookshelves in the library, and the whole play of surfaces. There's a facade surface here, one out here, one back inside, so that there's this continual layering of both vertical and horizontal, but essentially all trying to deny a single vertical surface and give precedent to the horizontal articulation. Next, please. Another shot of the interior of the library. Next. And what we tried to do in terms of getting from 1,500,000 square feet down to some very small, intimate human scale, you can see the dimensions here are very tight, and this happens in all of the buildings, that there is the compression of space, both in the vertical and horizontal scale, to bring the scale of these buildings, which are quite large, down to the individual appreciation of them. Next, please. Again, in the library building. Next. And you can see these, the columns that interrupt the space between the bookshelves, the surface, and another surface down here, and the space through there. Next. And the facade is not a curtain wall, as you'll see in the next building, the museum building, but it has a depth to it. You can see the mullions are in fact trusses that are both structural and hold the glass at different levels in place. Next. The library. Next. Now we're going to look at the research center building, which is just being completed. And here you can see the development of the music hall building as it's proceeding in construction. Next. A view from the tail of the the study center. Next. And here's the north surface, which is where these two buildings twist and turn. You'll see on the north surface the final edge of the north side of the project in the research building. And you can see the different levels of articulation of the vertical surface as the steel joins. This is steel and this is aluminium. So it's a very complex weaving of these surfaces in the project. Next. And this is the final building I'm going to show tonight. And this is the surface I want you to look at because it's quite extraordinary. It was detailed 3 times, one in a Rhino model by ourselves, the second in the executive project by the executive architects, and then third by the contractor, the subcontractors, who had to subcontract all of these pieces. And as you'll notice, this surface leans in here, twists through, and leans out. And even in the Rhino model, they didn't, the first glass that was delivered to the site had the size of the pieces of glass, but hadn't accounted for the twist in the surface. So every glass piece, the first 1,000 pieces were brought, were the wrong dimension. And they had to go back and be refabricated because the Rhino model had not been sophisticated enough to take the surface distortion into the calculation for the dimension. And even I was looking yesterday at the glazing and the gasketing for the glazing, and on a piece of glass like this, the gasket twists through from a horizontal to almost a vertical as a gasket on a piece of glass. I was quite taken by this. I don't know if it's good or bad, but nevertheless, the workmen do seem to find it amusing. Next, here's a close-up of the steel structure. You can see how it changes its angle all the way up and twists through. Next. Here you can see the interior of that steel structure, the services going in that will be under the soffits, but you can see the narrowness of the space and here is the second interior surface of the museum building. Next. And it's very hard to photograph. Here you can see they're just starting the soffits. I should tell you that some of the soffits are 10 meters deep to bring the scale of the building down. And of course, when the president of the region went up first on a lift and he saw this 10-meter space, he said, "Oh, look at this. I didn't know we had this. What is that?" And we had to explain that that was inside the soffit, and a strange moment in our relationship. Next, please. And here you begin to see the play between the soffit, the interior surface, and the exterior dimension of the so-called curtain wall. Next. See what the space is like. These surfaces are now all plastered in sheetrock. Next. And this is the last, this incline. The first thing was that we had to figure out how to pour the concrete on this slope because the concrete, the right mixture of water, sand, and cement slumped too much, and they couldn't keep the concrete on this surface. So this took almost 3 months of testing to find a way to put the concrete surface on. Then it was waterproofed, and then you can see the steel structure, which is holding all of the stone tiles. Next. Next. And you can see the workmen, and each tile is laid in, and it's laid in loose so that the water runs through, and we now, the final shots are, I just have the new pictures. It's taken itself all the way up to there. So it is a single man operation, or a single person operation. I think that's it. Is that the slide last? No, there's a shot. You can see the tiles going on there. Just to give you a sense of scale of this project, this is a 12,000 seat sport arena that is close by, so you can see the size of this project. I think it's too early to tell whether the question of genius loci is able to withstand the deterritorialization of the work. If it works, I think it will be an interesting commentary on this project. Can I have the lights, please? The final chapter in my essay deals with Rem Koolhaas, who has proposed in his theoretical, very sort of recent manifesto, let's say, of the last 10 years of junk space, that this is what capital is able to produce. This is the detritus of global capital, and that I don't want to read Rem for him, but in fact he has tried to say that since this is what capital produces, we must in some way not try to accommodate, to transcend capital, to accommodate capital, but to deny the influences of capital on our work. But what's interesting is that in doing so, Rem has changed, as it were, I believe, from what could be called the earlier work of decorated sheds to ducks. And of course, that's a really interesting phenomenon. In other words, to deny capital, he has, and I would argue that Seattle and Porto and Shanghai and other projects have become duck-like projects, so that the pendulum swings back and forth between the loss of the decorated shed being the Genius Loci project to the new Zeitgeist projects, which have become ducks and even decorated ducks. In conclusion, I said to this student when she was unable to answer the question, where would you go today? And I said, you know, you couldn't go anywhere because Las Vegas has become everywhere. That is, the signage that is Las Vegas is now Macau, and I remember Macau in 1955 had nothing to do with what it is today. The signage has become Tokyo, it has become New York City, it has become all, many of our major cities have become signs without sheds and without ducks. They've become merely the signs themselves. So that if you were writing this thesis, you wouldn't go to Las Vegas, and you would then question, is this where we want the world to go? And of course, this is the question that I have as somebody who has gone through, as it were, 3 generations of this iteration of the advance of capital. I'm not suggesting that we return to the question of a social or a communist discourse, but I think we have to reinvestigate the question of Zeitgeist and Genius Loci. To end that, there is an interesting book by Jacques Derrida called The Specters of Marx. And what Jacques concludes at the end is, in the last chapter, is that when the Berlin Wall comes down, Marxism is no longer an effective political operation in the Western world, but becomes a specter, that it becomes even more powerful as a non-reality. And it seems to me that we have a new Geist, or another kind of Geist, not a Volksgeist, not a Zeitgeist, but what would be called in German an Ahnungsgeist. An Ahnungsgeist being one which deals with the haunted, that is, the return of something that no longer exists, that becomes more potent. In other words, whether it's architecture, modern architecture, etc. And the reason why I bring up this question of the haunted, I'm doing a seminar this spring which I've titled Haunting Licenses, playing on the question of hunting licenses. And the haunting is a different Geist. And I've talked with Tony Vidler about it because Tony wrote a book on the uncanny. And the uncanny is basically in German unheimlich, which means unhomely, as it were, or don't feel it good at home. So the uncanny is a way of dealing with genius loci because it deals with place and home, whereas Ahnungsgeist deals with this question of the other half of this equation, that is a manifestation of the Zeitgeist. And if you would ever want to see a life, real life experience of what it means to go to a performance that is haunted, I suggest that you all go to see White Ribbon, Michael Haneke's new film, because if there's anything, and it is so different than any of his other films, that it is a film haunted by history and time. You can't, the film is not a scary thriller movie. Hardly anything happens, yet strange crimes occur. There's a stillness of the camera. There's no sound other than the voices. The film was made in color and then drained to black and white. So it's not a noir film of the 40s, nor is it a duotone film. It is black and white like you've never seen before. And it's a film enormously provocative, I think, for architects in terms of the silence of the space, in terms of the idea of the haunting. And of course, one is haunted. The film ends in 1914 in Germany with the shooting of the Duke of Sarajevo, which starts the whole chaotic condition of the 20th century. And of course, haunted by what these people who were now children, strange children in 1914, become by 1933. And of course, we know the answer. And so we're sitting there watching this film unfold, haunted not by the past, but by, in other words, the past of this film, but the present, which becomes our past. And I think that architecture has always this possibility to be haunted. And the question, like the haunted house, which is the genius loci, what is the equivalent of the haunted Geist, the Ahnungsgeist? And that is the question that I'm asking my students and I'm asking myself. And I think for me, it's a way of looking at what one might do in not only teaching, but in practicing architecture today. Thank you very much. I would take questions or comments or whatever.
Thank you. Questions?
Robert.
A lot of round columns in your work.
And there's some round columns
There
and
are
some
quite a lot
square
of them,
and
quite a
some
lot.
square ones.
I wanted to ask, those round columns are part of rhetoric or part of grammar?
I think they're both. in this case, they determine, the round columns determine an 8-meter grid. The square columns determine a 4-meter and a 16-meter grid. So in order to differentiate between a 4-meter and a 16-meter grid, we made round columns in the 8-meter grid. Now that's a grammatical notion, but it also refers to the fact that the column, the round column, has an attitude in space that we know about. So it's both. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm studying architecture design processes, and I'm interested to ask you about the novelty of new idea, the new ideas in architecture, and do architects need to define new ideas or just to recognize the emergence of new idea?
Well, first of all, if I were to give the second half of my lecture, I would argue that we are in a late moment in the cosmological condition of our society. We are in a late moment of capital. We are in a late moment of development, of globalization at the end almost of its capacity to become more global. So I don't think it's possible to be new today because there is not a new condition as there was, let's say, at the end of in the French Revolution, at the end of the 18th century, at the end of the 19th century. There hasn't been a condition of the new in the late 20th century. I believe in the cycles of history that there will be a new cosmology, a new, as Foucault would say, episteme, and that new episteme, I think, has not yet been defined. We are what I would consider to be in a late condition, as articulated by people like Theodor Adorno and Edward Said and others. They compare this moment in time to Beethoven's late works, which could not have been avant-garde. And so I don't think there's anything new possible. It's a reworking of a lot of old things and looking into the discipline. I wanted to return to Bob Maxwell's comment, because what's interesting, Bob, is that I went to Wolf Prix's office last fall, and he said, I want to do a building without columns. And so here you're pointing to a building that has an excessive amount of columns, and here is a person wanting to do a building without columns. I say, why in God's name would one want to do a building without columns? I can't for the life of me understand. I mean, I look at this space and I say, what would this space be like without the damn columns? I said, it wouldn't be the same. And we wouldn't appreciate, now I'm not going back to Leon Krier when I say that, but I think there is a use of columns which is important and which I think saves a project. Wolf's project is about the new and the possibility of the new, the possibility of single surface projects that have no columns and have no space, basically, have no thickness. There are a lot of things that they don't have. So I think it's possible to look at these things in a different way today without returning to the classical or the neoclassical or the postmodern, etc., and to find a different grammatical conjugation for these things which have nothing to do with being new. I think the idea of being new today is an oxymoron. I think it's impossible to be new. Hanneke's work is not new work. It comes out of Bresson, it comes out of the French New Wave, it comes out of German Expressionism, it comes out of many, many different things. But it's not the same. It's an investigation of space and time that Bresson started in 1960 with 400 coups. So I'm not that was Truffaut, sorry. Same guys. 1960 was a really important time. So I don't believe what I'm trying to talk about or suggest is that we should be new. You all, as students, at some point in your life, will find the need or the moment in time where the new is possible. The revolution that supposedly parametric processes and algorithms gave to us, I don't think was a revolution at all. I think was a manifestation of a late form of capitalism. And I think these things that we deal with today, like sustainability and green architecture and all, are manifestations of capital trying to use ecology to sell products to an unwary public, etc., because they don't have anything else to do. I don't think sustainability and ecology and green architecture are a new thing. I don't think putting fuzz on buildings has anything to do with the way the world is. And, you know, it seems to me that Borromini's buildings are still standing. They seem sustainable. And I don't think we need to fetishize capital products that deal with sustainability. I mean, I can tell you that our AIA is telling our students that we need to become LEED certified. Now, you may not have that in England, but now to get a project in the United States, you have to have a LEED certified architect, another form of commercialism, who can't design their way out of anything, but have a LEED certificate. And to get a LEED certificate, you have to have somebody waive something like, I suppose, making kosher meat. I'm not certain, but it's something like that, lest I be accused of anti-Semitism. Waving LEED over it and saying it's okay. Paul Rudolph's building at Yale was just renovated and came out to be a LEED certificate building. So if Paul Rudolph can get a LEED certificate for that building, which is so environmentally correct, any building can. So I think we're merely witnessing all of these new phenomena, whether they're parametrics, algorithms, sustainability, all the stuff that you're being fed with is, in fact, another form of the globalization of capital. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that you describe us as being in a late moment. I mean, I personally would argue that we're, in fact, just at the beginning of a new condition. And while it's not revolving around parametric design, it's in fact, I mean, you've invoked Hegel, and you've essentially prolonged the dialectic economic arguments of Zeitgeist from Derrida and Fukuyama. The dialectic, as I see it today, would be the relationship between the real and the virtual, or the real and the digital. And it's interesting that you mentioned haunting, and you said it's the return of something that doesn't exist. I mean, I wonder what you would say to that.
Well, first of all, there's clearly something that is haunted. I mean, in other words, you can't produce haunting out of just any digital process. It requires an idea of, and I think Hanna's work shows the influence of the individual thinking about how to produce this feeling. I mean, I can only tell you that I watched the Haneke film for the second time the night before the Grammys, okay? And then I watched the Grammys, which is the digital manifestation of everything that is wrong with the world as far as I'm concerned. Maybe my parents felt that way about the Beatles in '63. I don't know. But certainly the fetishization of light, technology, graphics, to produce what I would call idiocy is something that I don't think represents a new Geist, number one. I would say Avatar, the movie, the gross, the best all-time grosser, has a dumb story, all right? A really silly children's idea of a story wrapped up in wild technology. So here's technology searching for a Geist. To conclude that question, because I think it's something I would like to put to rest, one is that all of these things still conform to the metaphysical project, that is, the project of Kant and Hegel, let's say. And it's rearticulated in Heidegger's genius loci project. It's reiterated even and Derrida said that architecture is the locus of the metaphysical project, and all of post-structuralism was about a critique of the relationship between the sign and the signified. And architecture, again, is one of those discourses that deals with signs and signifieds. And no one, with all of these technological processes, have dealt with the metaphysical dialectic, that is the question of presence. And architecture, as Jacque would argue, is the locus of presence. We are in presence. No matter how virtual an environment becomes, it can become graphics. You can show them on screens. You can seduce clients with all kinds of virtual graphics. But ultimately, you have to build three-dimensional space. And that's what we as architects do. We are not computer animators. We don't produce film. We don't produce literature. We don't produce sculpture. We produce inhabitable three-dimensional space, which is always metaphysical because it deals with presence. How we deal with that, I think that architecture becomes a very significant discipline when we have all of these processes that produce virtual environments. But how architecture uses those virtual processes, let's say, as rhetorical advices and produces a grammar, I haven't seen yet, other than these chicken coops at Harvard and these fantastic magazines. I mean, I love Hernan Diaz Alonso. He's one of my favorite people, worked for me for some time. And every one of his studios, they produce chicken coops. You know, bigger holes, larger holes, swoops and things. And they'll never build anything. They're great graphics. They're fun to take a visual walking tour through. But if you want to be an architect, which is something I've desperately wanted to be, even though Rem said I'm an architect like a B movie, you know, I haven't gotten over my B movie status. I'm still trying, you know. But it ain't easy, and I don't think there is anything new. If there is, I'm not teaching it because I don't know what it is. I'm not teaching sustainability. I'm not teaching eco-friendly. You know, I don't eat broccoli. I'll eat it in heaven forever. You know, and I still teach Palladio because I think the lessons of Palladio are still important. There's one back here. We'll take one.
I can't see it.
Yeah.
On the back here.
Yeah, you. Right. Go ahead.
I'm quite interested in understanding how you define your own grammar. How can we understand the project or state what is your grammar?
Yeah, well,
that eventually is a vague.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and it's not a question I can answer with a one-liner or keep this audience here for another hour, because it ain't easy to define. But I could take you through, and in fact, I would like to think that my book, 10 Canonical Buildings, traces a series of grammars as they've unfolded in 10 architects in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, with Jim and Venturi and Rossi. It's all the way through to Gehry, Koolhaas, and Libeskind. I could have written an 11th chapter about my grammar onto that. So certainly I could do that. I don't believe in teaching today my grammar, because I think that what we need is to find a grammar more contingent upon the rhetorical tropes and devices that the computation and the environment, the scale of build and capital, global capital have put upon us. Before we close, there are some people that had asked me to sign books. I don't think it's I always have people sign books. I have a whole library full of signed books. They're worth no more than, I think probably less than the unsigned books. But I'm prepared to sit here and sign books if you guys want. But thank you very much for having me.